All right, welcome to this series on 3D design using Adobe Illustrator and Fusion 360. What this set of videos is really meant to do is show you a little bit about my process. So in Fusion, you can create your sketches. If you're familiar, or even if you're not, you can create these two-dimensional sketches, which then you can sort of use to create 3D objects pretty easily. And I would say that the learning curve is pretty low as far as learning how to do this. And there are plenty of video tutorials sort of going over how to use sketches in Fusion. And I've done a lot of those, and I'm pretty good at doing that. There are a lot of tools to learn as far as what you can do with the 2D sketches. But I come from a design background, and I'm pretty adept with Adobe Illustrator, and I found that sort of, especially when it comes to really quickly getting ideas for 3D objects out or wanting to rapidly prototype something, I find it a lot faster and a lot more flexible to use Illustrator. Now Illustrator is a two-dimensional vector graphics program, and so it's very similar to what you see in Fusion 360 as far as doing sketches. So if you're more into using Fusion and you're kind of watching this because you want to see what else is possible, and you have Illustrator available to you, this could be interesting. I would say, though, this is going to be more geared towards someone who knows Illustrator, either as a beginner or intermediate user or even expert, and creating a workflow to get your Illustrator designs into Fusion in a way where you still are working with precise dimensions, because that's really important when you are creating things to be 3D printed or created. You lose a little bit of features as far as what Fusion has to maintain your precision and your ability to change things after the fact. So you're going to lose a little bit there. But I'm going to kind of walk you through some tools and things you can do to make it a little easier on yourself. So welcome, and hope you enjoy this tutorial. So I'm here in Illustrator, and I want to kind of walk through this interface that I've set up because I have customized it for 3D design. So I'm going to start over on the right, and we'll sort of work our way to the left. So we've got an info panel, and you can find all of these things under window, and then you can see, if you're not seeing some of these things, you should be able to turn them on here. And you can see I've created a workspace called 3D Design. So I just said new workspace, called it 3D Design. And then if you ever want to sort of resave it, you can just say new workspace again, and then call it the same thing. And you can see clicking OK will overwrite, and that's fine. So you can create a workspace, you can update it and tweak it, get it exactly how you want it. So the info panel is really nice because you're going to see, your measurements and sort of where you are on the coordinate plane. So that's really nice. The properties panel, also extremely useful. Now, I'm going to definitely advocate that one of the reasons why Illustrator is so much faster and better for me is because I have gotten very intimate with the keyboard shortcuts. And so if you learn all the keyboard shortcuts for all the different tools and sort of toggles that you need to know to do different things, you can work extremely rapidly. Versus I've learned some of the keyboard shortcuts in Fusion, but I would say they're still a little bit limiting. And then for the most part, a lot of the details come into interacting with the different panels that show up on Fusion. So it's a little bit, slower and clunkier in Fusion. So properties panel has a lot of really useful features. A lot of these, again, are keyboard shortcuts that you should end up learning, but you have a lot at your fingertips here in this panel. So you can change your units. And so generally, if you're doing any sort of 3D design for 3D printing, we're often working in millimeters. So setting your document units to millimeters is really important. Using the ruler and grids, so maybe by default you don't have a ruler or grid, You can toggle them on and off here. And we'll look a little bit deeper into how we can use these in a lot of really cool ways. Guides, you can kind of ignore this, or I kind of ignore this for this type of design. Except for this one here, the hide smart or the smart guides. I generally leave that turned on. You're going to find that this is really useful, sort of almost like hints that pop up as you're drawing, as far as like where things are, or if you want things to connect to other things. These smart guides really help with that. Snapping options, again, this is something that you might end up toggling a lot, especially snap to grid. So if you're using the grid and you want to keep things really precise and aligned to the grid, you want to turn on snap to grid. But sometimes when you're doing something more freeform, you want to turn that off. And then you almost always want to keep snap to point on. So keyboard increments, we can, using the arrow keys, we can adjust things based on a very specific amount of spacing. So we might want to use something like a 0.1 millimeter. So every time you hit the arrow key, when you have something selected, it moves it by 0.1 millimeter. So that's really great for precision. Another big one that you might toggle on and off depending on what's going on, and we'll take a look at it, is scaling strokes and effects. So sometimes there are a lot of really neat ways to utilize strokes in Illustrator for your 3D design and to create things like offsets and buffers or thicknesses using strokes. And so sometimes you want to make something bigger, but you don't want to change what that offset is or what that thickness is. And so you might want to turn this off. And sometimes you do. You want it to sort of, as you scale it up, you want that thickness to scale with it. So you want to turn it back on. So another just item that you might find yourself toggling through a lot. Moving over, well, we've got the layers panel, and we'll look at layers and how you can use those actually with Fusion 360. So you can actually make multiple sketches in Fusion just using one single file by using layers, which is really cool. Pathfinder, it's a bit of a complex thing, but once you learn how to use the Pathfinder, it's extremely powerful in doing different types of vector manipulations. And then the thing that kind of goes with that is Pathfinder has a lot of really useful tools, as well as the shape builder tool. So I'm going to skip ahead over here. The shape builder and the Pathfinder kind of go together, and they're kind of similar in what they do, but they work. Usually one works better than the other depending on different circumstances. Transform, so when we have some object here, the transform panel kind of comes alive, and we have a lot of very precise things that we can do to it. So we can modify the width and the height very precisely. We can keep those things, we can constrain the aspect ratio of those things very easily or not. So really nice way to deal with shapes in a precision way. We've also got the align panel. So the align panel, again, is going to be something really nice to get multiple parts of your sketch to line up in different ways. Stroke, like I mentioned before, it can be a really powerful tool as far as, when you add a stroke to something and make it bigger, we can actually use millimeter units with stroke. So I could say I want this to be 10 millimeters, and I'll actually get a stroke that the thickness here is 10 millimeters, and we can actually turn that into more shapes. So really nice way to work with your sketches. And that's about it for the panels that I've set up. So these are probably the most useful panels. You may want to leave colors and swatches out here, just because sometimes when you're drawing something, you want to apply some fills to actually see some differentiation between things, but for the most part they won't matter for the piece that's getting imported into Fusion. And then finally, I've created this little toolbar here. So in Illustrator, you can go to toolbars, window toolbars, and you can say new toolbar, and then you can actually just click these three dots and you can start adding different tools to the toolbar. So it's a really specific toolbar that I've created for 3D design. And these are like the most common tools that I use for doing any of my stuff. So the direct selection tool, which is, again, these are all you're going to want to learn. Probably most of these you're going to want to learn the keyboard shortcut for. So V for selection tool versus direct selection tool, where you want to actually just pick out a node. So selection tool will select the whole path and object, versus the direct selection tool will just choose one node so you can modify it. And you'll be switching between those constantly. So V and A for the keyboard shortcuts. The pen tool, which is great for tracing images that you bring in to get some really nice curves and precision in your tracing. The rectangle tool, again, probably the most used tool. So the rectangle tool is extremely versatile in Illustrator, and that's because actually with the rectangle tool, you know, sometimes I'll actually go for the ellipse tool, but really with the rectangle tool you have these smart corners where you can just turn any rectangle into like a curved, kind of like adding a fillet to any corner, and so it makes it an extremely robust tool where you can just start with a box and you can create all these really incredible shapes. But sometimes you do work with the ellipse tool. It's quick. You can just hit L as the shortcut. So M for rectangle, L for ellipse. And then the rest, maybe don't use quite as much, maybe the shape builder, but you can create hexagons. So if you're doing any sort of like nuts and bolts type thing, the hexagons work really well. Star, probably use that a lot less. Shape builder, we touched on that. It's very similar to Pathfinder, but we'll see how it works. It's kind of more of an advanced tool, but you can do some really powerful things with it. The last ones here I don't use a lot, but I do see how they can be really useful, and so I did include them on this panel because you might find yourself really comfortable or in a situation where you need to use these. So there's the knife tool, the scissors, the measure tool, which for the most part with all these info and property panels, you don't really need to use. But if you really wanted to measure something that wasn't quite part of the path, you could definitely do that. And the erase tool. So that's pretty much a tour of what I've set up. All the tools over here on the left are just the default tools that come in. And so we can kind of move on to get started with how do we create 3D objects with Illustrator.